one thing which I would like to get across, and sort of a philosophical point, is that this was a time which we were all very young, and we had no qualms about just doing things. But not only were the people who were first involved very young, the fields that we were working in were partly very young. Particle physics, for example, was brand new. It had evolved out of nuclear physics just a few years before. And solid state physics, which evolved into condensed matter physics, was not new, but the methods had just changed and the experiments had changed. So we had a group of people who were very excited about new things, and we had an opportunity to build something totally new. Bernice complains about this from time to time. She says her generation, 10 years later, did not have this kind of opportunity because we could start something, we had no fear, just went off and did things, and we were able ultimately to get enough support to make it a permanent institution. But it was the excitement of doing something new. So we were actually at a time in which universities were expanding rapidly, the national laboratories had been established, and people got substantial responsibilities at very young ages. And that has changed. The people who are involved in the operation of the Physics Center now, that some of us think of as the young people, are half again or twice as old as we were when we started out. So it was a very exciting time, and we really did have an opportunity to do something new. Now, I wanted to say a little bit about the evolution of the center once it was going. The first few years, of course, we were part of the Aspen Institute, which took care of a lot of details, did the bookkeeping, not always to our liking, but took care of things like that. And then basically the Aspen Institute trustees decided they didn't want to be involved with all these young, outspoken types. We would go over and participate in some of their seminars and have raging arguments, and they didn't much go for that. But we became independent corporation in 1968, and started right out with George Stranahan as the president. He had been running things as far as the center was concerned up until that point, and then several of us who had been around from the beginning became officers. I became chair of the executive committee. And what was interesting is from the very beginning, the center was self-organizing. George was very junior. He started out, as you heard, as a graduate student when he first had the idea for the center. So he wanted advice on program, operations, etc. Though from our point of view, he was the person who had the contact with money. So this was a good combination. So it started out very quickly that we formed an informal executive committee, which gradually took over the operations, because George had gone through his physics phase and eventually moved out here permanently and was a rancher in Woody Creek, just a few miles from Aspen, and his interest shifted totally in that direction. But first he did work hard on his physics, did well enough that he got tenure at Michigan State University, but as soon as he got tenure, his interest shifted out here. But he was gradually getting out of the operations. So the executive committee took over the day-to-day operations. It was very interesting because there were two of us who made a very good combination. That was myself, who's handling mostly operations, working with Sally Mensimer, trying to keep things on track, and David Pines, who had lots of contacts. He was very much, you could say, an operator, but in the sense that he knew people and made a point of getting to know people. So when we needed contact with people for getting money, credibility, etc., David was a very good person to work with. So we would go back and forth on things. Others were very much involved in operations, but less so in the hands-on part. When we became independent then, this structure continued. Some of the people who had been involved became officers. I was kept as chair of the executive committee doing the work. And that went on for 4 years, and then I became president in 1972. And as it has been mentioned by many people, we did all the work ourselves. So you're really intimately involved in all aspects. I did the admissions 3 times, the last time with Bernice, and kept track of the bookkeeping, etc. Mike Cohn was treasurer, but he wasn't around nearly as much, so we had to keep track of the finances, all the buildings and grounds stuff, etc. But it worked very well, and we were able to get younger people, well, younger people who by that time were older than we were when we started, involved, and they have taken over. My attitude has been very much, you get other people involved, step back, let them make their own mistakes. Give them advice, make it clear that you'll give them advice if they want it. But the center has evolved a whole lot as the physics fields have evolved, and the way of doing physics has evolved. Because when we started out, there were far fewer physicists than there are now. And you got to know a lot more people in multiple fields than people do at this point. And it was easier to get recognition in the sense that you could publish in Physical Review. When I was a graduate student, I would read all the abstracts in Physical Review every time it came out. Couldn't possibly do that now with any understanding. So the things have changed a whole lot, and some of the old timers don't much like that, but that's the way things go. So up until the present, I'm happy to give advice and do certain things which other people haven't taken over, but basically let the younger people run the program and look for the funding and so on. We've had to revise the bylaws various times, and I was in charge of that and basically did it and with our lawyer, and then revised them again a couple of years ago, always trying to adapt our mode of operation to the realities of the time. So continue on that, and if people need to know about legal issues, etc., then I will help them with that. The other main thing is buildings and grounds, which I've been involved with since the beginning. And Bernice, when we were first married, would come over with me. We would trim the trees and weed the garden, right. All kinds of things, which the physicists did at the time. And I know the buildings since I was involved and when all of them were built and so on. So I sort of supervise that, though the staff, Jane and Paula in particular, take charge of projects and do most of it. I'm mainly interested in the things which don't quite get done because they have different responsibilities as well. The first big transition in the Physics Center in terms of size, et cetera, occurred at the same time as we became independent corporation. And that's when the National Accelerator Laboratory had their 2 summer studies here. And that was a very interesting whole program. 1967, in the late summer, early fall, I had talked to Ned Goldwasser. Ned was the associate director of the National Accelerator Laboratory, in charge of lots of operations. The director, Bob Wilson, had been out here in the summer, and he just loved the mountains and loved Aspen, and hoped we could get some arrangements to come back. He was interested initially in having a theoretical physics group here, sponsoring a group of particle physicists, because National Accelerator Laboratory in 1967 was well advanced as far as planning accelerator was concerned, but they hadn't really done much yet about making plans for experimental areas, which is a really big deal with the laboratory that scale, and they had not done anything much about having a theoretical physics program. So the initial idea was that they would sponsor about 15 theoretical physicists to come out here and be part of the Physics Center program. Well, we didn't have space for that, but things evolved quickly, because once Wilson started thinking about it seriously, thought, well, this would be a great place to have the summer study, because it's some place that you can get people to come. And that's true. Later studies for other accelerators have happened, not at the Physics Center, but happened in the Snowmass area, just 18 or so miles away, and people will come, and it works very well. The NAL summer study was one of a series which has gone on with first that accelerator and then later ones, which you get a group of physicists together. In this case, it was about 75 experimental physicists who were trying to plan experiments and plan the kinds of facilities that they would need to actually be able to do experiments at this accelerator. And then there was ultimately about 25 theoretical physicists in addition who were giving advice, what experiments would be interesting, what should you be looking for. And the combination, you've got lots of interchange and ideas come out that people haven't thought about before. Generally, the way it works is that the summer study doesn't pay you anything. It may pay for some people travel, etc., but it arranges housing and facilities so that a group of people who are interested can get together and really study these things. For example, one summer study I remember other than that one was one in Snowmass, 1984, when it was extremely exciting because we were planning the next accelerator, which ultimately didn't get built. But we were really discussing what you needed to do the kind of physics that people were interested in. So Fermilab, now NAL then, sponsored this. And I have correspondence connected with the negotiations on this. I was on the NAL Physics Advisory Committee, and had conversations with Ned Goldwasser in the fall, and then more conversations, and we eventually decided that this would be a very good thing for the Physics Center because it would allow us to expand, first, the group of people who knew about us, and secondly, we thought it was a way to get expanded facilities. And that part is very interesting. George Stranahan called me up in the fall and said, after we decided to go ahead, said, "Do you think it'd be a good idea to build a building?" I said, "Yes, good idea." But where's the money coming from? Well, what ultimately happened was that George persuaded the Aspen Institute to put the cash up front to pay for a new temporary building but then he personally guaranteed it. And where the money ultimately came from, I'm not sure, because the Physics Center, based on rent from NAL, paid back some of it, and George may well have covered some of it. I'm not sure of the details, and they don't appear in our records, just that things were paid off. In any case, the new building was designed by one of the eminent local architects, but not as an eminent local building. It was just a shell. It looked more or less like three very large trailers stuck together, wooden siding, and just absolutely bare inside. But it worked for what we needed. All we had to do was get some secondhand furniture in there, and people had a place to sit and blackboards to talk at, and we already had the physics library. The library, interestingly enough, was one of the best physics libraries between Chicago and the West Coast. Los Alamos, of course, had everything. But this library had the remarkable distinction that the books were selected by physicists, not by librarians, and they were cataloged by physicists, not by librarians. So you could actually be pretty sure that what you wanted was there, and you knew how to find it because you knew what the subject categories meant. In any case, the building designed by Benedict was built at very low cost, some $46,000 over a period from sometime late April till June. It was all ready, and the summer study showed up. Now there's a very interesting side issue on this, which not many people know about. Though 1968 was hippie days around here. Aspen had a very conservative mayor, Shorty Pabst of the brewing company, and a magistrate, Guido Meyer, who ran one of the local restaurants, who was also quite conservative. And the police department responded to these people, and they didn't like hippies. Shorty Pabst's statement in the newspaper was, "We want deep pocket tourists, not people wandering through just enjoying the mountains or camping out in the mountains." And physicists were not exactly deep pocket tourists either, but we kept a low profile. Ned Goldwasser, when Fermilab was first being built out in what was then rural Illinois, had gone to the neighboring towns and around to people who were advertising housing and so on, and made sure that it was very well known that anybody who refused to rent to a minority was never going to get any Fermilab business and be in trouble as far as he was concerned. He was highly successful in this because everyone wanted the accelerator out there, and he made it very clear that you were not going to have business from the laboratory unless you were welcoming. Well, Richard Wilson, a physicist at Harvard, knew of this, and he also knew that there was difficulty out here because people wandering, backpacking through town looked like hippies would get arrested, and Guido would not just send them out of town, he'd put them in jail for a couple of days. It was bad. But, you know, these people are having a really good time. They are actually memorialized in the name of one of the ski runs out at Snowmass. She was Naked Lady, because it was not unusual when you were out hiking in the mountains to encounter people running around topless or whatever. Physicists didn't care, but apparently Pabst and Guido cared a whole lot. Well, there's a letter from Goldwasser to the city saying that we understand that you have some problems and you're not very welcoming. And he had impact. I don't know how he did it, but the same kind of impact he had in Illinois. And there's a delightful letter from the end of that summer, end of the first summer study, from George Stranahan to Ned Goldwasser. It said, "Dear Ned, Guido Meyer was fired. The police were given a warning by a federal judge. NAL has gone, and Aspen has returned to its ground state." So actually, that made quite an impact in the social setting here, as well as the physics. In any case, the new building the Institute originally wanted built on the site of the Jerome stables. The Jerome Hotel had stables. Fortunately, the city objected, so they relented and let us build it on our campus here. So it became ultimately one of our long-term buildings. But the original agreement was for 3 years only. And there was a fabled lease for $1 a year that the Institute gave the Physics Center for the original building, now called Stranahan Hall, and then also for Hilbert Hall. And for years, nobody could find the lease. And nobody knew if anybody had ever paid $1 a year or if the Institute had ever acknowledged it. I found that. There's actually a document which is not a lease. It is a letter from the president of the Aspen Institute to George Stranahan saying, "This is our agreement." And this letter serves, it says explicitly, in place of a lease. That we get Stranahan Hall for 10 years for $1 a year, and we can renew it for successive 10-year periods. And there is a key phrase in there, which I don't think anyone ever picked up, that if we didn't pay the $1 a year, so we were in arrears, they had to notify us, at which point we had 30 days to pay. They never notified us of anything. As far as anyone knows, we never paid the $1 a year either, but it worked out ultimately. When I first came out here in 1962, came to town, we got our housing, came out here we didn't come to the Physics Center because it wasn't finished. We went over to the Aspen Institute where Bob Craig was, and his secretary told us where we were going to stay, gave us keys to the housing and so on, and actually had an office over there for the first couple of weeks while the first building, Stranahan Hall, was completed. It was sitting in the edge of a field, the end of 6th Street. Right next to us was a stables to the south, and that's where our newest building, Smart Hall, now is. A very elegant building. The area where Beta Hall is, where we're filming, was just meadow. There was nothing here at all. And the big rock out behind Beta Hall was way off in the meadow, and that was a favorite climbing rock for little kids. So I'd bring kids over here in the evening to climb on that. And to the east, 200 or 300 feet away, was a coal yard, a little coal yard. Not much left of it, but that was about it in the neighborhood. There was very scattered housing around, lots of vacant lots, and the place was just very much the way it had been, I assume, in the 1880s, but a lot of the houses from that period had disappeared. In fact, when we built our house on this little lot, 60 feet wide, we found the foundations of 2 of the miners' houses. So the area was really quite undeveloped. All streets were, of course, gravel. And going through town on Highway 82, it was paved, 2 lanes in the middle of this very wide gravel street. That was That was the state's doing, not the city's doing. As soon as you got out of town, it was to the east, it was all gravel. And that was the only paved street in town. So things were really quite different. Now, of course, all the vacant lots have been filled in and things are better shape. We always thought we should buy a little Victorian house just to have, but that never quite worked out. In front of Stranahan, there was actually no yard. It was just field. And we had a gravel walk and a gravel parking lot, about half the size of the present parking lot, and that was it. It was just wild. And to the east, where the Institute now has Hilbert Hall, was just a meadow again. The Aspen Institute at that time consisted just of offices over at the center, no Pepke or anything. The music parking lot was just tracks into the meadow, basically. And the original music tent was delightful because it had been designed by Eero Saarinen, the famous architect, but it was basically a circus tent. And you'd go in there for a concert, and when the wind came up, the tent would rise, and these big, giant posts would come up off the ground. They had to tie them down. So it would come up, and then the wind would die down and go clunk.